have always wanted to do something like that because I do love research and I do love biography work, because I think it's the many, many pleasures that astrology holds in store. So whenever I have free time on my hands, I look up biographies, I double check with the charts, and then I watch documentaries. And whenever I come across interesting people, and you know, I mean, normally my job as couple therapist is to solve any entanglements and to disentangle patterns, toxic patterns as they were. But sometimes, I mean, it's even more entertaining to come across people, and I once heard the expressions, those two were put on earth simply for the reason to piss each other off. I love that. It's brilliant. Like to get on each other's nerves. Another expression, which is really 8th house, Plutonian stuff, is like someone's going under my skin. And I came up with 3 interesting couples, if you will, enemies, frenemies, whatever, what have you. And I wanted to kick off with, I mean, like the initial bitch fest between Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots. And the fascinating thing about both of our heroines, or villainesses, if you will, is that they are still very present, because, I mean, book after book, podcast after podcast, every Hollywood generation has its own version. So they're really, really part of what I call our subconsciousness, right? And the problem, of course, is that we have our myths about them, and it's tainted, and one has to dig deeper to get more complexity and get all the facets, because none of them is one-dimensional. And of course, they never met. Yeah, this is from the 1971 movie, I think the best one, starring Vanessa Redgrave as Mary and Glenda Jackson as Queen Elizabeth. And Glenda Jackson as Queen Elizabeth had, after that, a BBC series in the early 70s. So I like them best. And the film is really entertaining. It's brilliant music conducted by John Barry. But as I said, they never met in real life. Mary was always keen, but Elizabeth always shied away because she didn't want to get compared. Mary was more beautiful, she was taller, and she was known to have that magic spell. So Mary had that charisma about her, which we will find in her chart as well, of course. Right. So to kick off, they were cousins, because both were descendants from Henry VII. So they were distant cousins, right? To kick it off. So it's always best to compare the background, the circumstances, then to compare the very, very different personalities, and then to shed light on the astrological details to get a little bit, you know, meat on the bones, as it were. And let's kick off with Mary. So Mary was spoiled in childhood, if you will, because she was sent to France to protect her, because Henry VIII wanted to kidnap her, and her mother sent her to her homeland, to France, where she grew up as the future wife of the Dauphin. And when she was 16 years old, she was married to the Dauphin of France. And 1 year later, she became Queen of France. And 1 year after that, she was already widowed. So by the time she was 18, she had experienced more than any other woman, particularly at that time, went through in a lifetime. So why am I saying she was spoiled? Because she grew up at the most accomplished Renaissance court in France. So you can still visit the castles along the Loire River. And of course, she grew up as a French princess and then the French queen, and the benefit that she was also queen of the Scots, because her father died when she was just excuse me, my voice is a wee bit challenged. So she was Queen of the Scots when she was aged 6 days, right? And the interesting thing about Mary is that, like a candle burning from both sides, so by the time she was 25, she had experienced so much adventure and excitement and blood and war and love and hatred. And then she gets imprisoned. So from age 25 until her death, age 44, she was imprisoned, and she couldn't live, as it were, anymore. Of course, we will find out that she was very active. She had servants, she had a rich correspondence, but still there was no visible Mary from that time on. So she was a very passionate woman, very, very self-confident, and she was particularly self-confident and felt at ease among men. Now, watching from the portraits, it's not really so obvious why she was considered a beauty, but there must have been something about her which was really magic. So she had a slender, tallish figure. She could dance. She loved to dance. She was very sportive. So she was a very good sportswoman. And contemporaries were always smitten with her. So what became of her? So history has her put down as the martyr queen and for the lost Catholic cause, which of course by this time, so end of the 16th century, on the British Isles, that was a lost cause. So when we talk about Mary, it's all very romantic, it's very tragic. And so we might put her a wee bit down as a victim queen, which is a bit like Princess Diana territory. And we know by now that that's like way, way, way too one-dimensional. And Mary had different sides to her character. So let's compare her with her cousin, Elizabeth. Elizabeth had a very, very hard beginning. She was proclaimed a bastard after her mother's death, Anne Boleyn, and under the reign of her father, her half-brother, and her half-sister, Bloody Mary, she was constantly in danger. So she was imprisoned in the Tower at one time, and she nearly escaped death. She nearly escaped assassinations, and, which is very interesting, she became queen at 25. So at 25, Mary's official life ceases to exist, whereas Elizabeth gets into the spotlight. For Elizabeth, nothing was to be taken granted. So she was so the opposite of being spoiled, and having undergone trauma in her childhood and youth, even as a young woman, she was particularly cautious. She was a very anxious woman. She was a very complex woman. She was suspicious of men because, judging from her father, from uncles, from Robert Dudley, from her courtiers, she knew that she couldn't attach her life to any man because she would lose control. And that's why she presumably decided to stay a virgin. Some sources claim that she might had been physically unable to enjoy physical encounters. We don't know that, of course. It's all speculation here. But history was on her side, and differently to Mary, she was always surrounded by very, very clever men. And by now, we couldn't even tell which were her doings, her ideas, her politics, and which were just the influence of her politicians, her courtiers. So we might say she had history on her side versus Mary had history against her. So she created herself as, you know, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the mother of her people. So again, we have a myth. And of course, the Elizabethan age is the very core of what later became the British Empire. So we have Shakespeare, we have, so she is really the first Renaissance monarch, if you will. Interesting thing is that those two enemies, one Scottish queen, the other one English queen, the inheritor was James, Mary's son, who was the first king of Great Britain and who inherited the throne after Elizabeth's death in 1603. So a Stuart king. Okay. All right, so let's start with the many facets of Elizabeth. So of course, we always have the beautiful young heroine. This is from a film with Kate Blanchett, so very pale, very Gothic, we would call it today. Then, of course, we have the conniving queen, the witty queen, the you don't know what she's thinking because she's so conniving and she's so clever and so intelligent, always something going on behind these eyes. And by the way, she had black eyes, almost black, inherited from her mother, Anne Boleyn. Then, of course, we have the Gloriana image, which still is predominant these days. And of course, she was a fashion icon, we would call her today. And if you think of her as an old, bony woman with badly decayed teeth and tons of makeup and a wig and those very, very heavy costumes, we can almost feel her shivering under all that finery. And then, of course, we have mad Elizabeth, like, you know, like a pressure cooker, like, and at any moment, the lid could fly off. She was very, very moody. She was a moody woman. And this is how, this is a painting that she commissioned. And of course, this puts her as Gloriana on the right-hand side, and her father is sitting in the center, and on the left-hand side is her sister, Bloody Mary, with Philip of Spain, with Mars in tow. So that's sort of like, okay, that's like the wrong side of history and the Catholic revenge. And she has Spring and Venus in tow. And in her back, at her back is her half-brother Edward, who only got to live to the young age of 15, right? So, of course, being the daughter of infamous Henry with his 6 women, you know, she must have felt that men could not be relied upon. And she grew up in the household of her of one of Henry's wives, the one who got away. So when he died in 1547, it's one of the Catherines. I always mix them up, Catherine Howard or Catherine Parr. And she married again, and she was so very fond of young Elizabeth that she invited her to live in her household. But her stepfather tried to seduce Elizabeth, so she had to escape, because nothing could tarnish her reputation as a pure Protestant princess. So she always had to behave, be a model. She was very learned. She could speak Latin, Greek, Italian, French, Spanish, you name it. Very, very shrewd lady. And in the middle, this old man, this is Cecil, her top politician, who really advised her against many follies. So it's due to him that she was a wise politician, right? And then, of course, the love of her life, Robert Dudley, they grew up together and they were friends. And of course, he would have liked to marry her, but she shied away from it. And there's no doubt about that. This was a man whom she really had deep feelings for. Right. So, of course, she had many suitors, and she used the marriage market to her advantage. And she played that card until she was end of her 40s. So she was really shrewd. And she accumulated lots of jewelry and other presents. So, yeah, to let her suitors astray, right? So if we, from a psychological angle, want to get a grip of how she must have been, how she must have felt, this feeling of constantly being in danger to get assassinated, there were always plots against her, and yet she went out in public. She said, I have to be seen by the people. I'm not afraid of getting assassinated. But then, of course, she had horrible nightmares. She kept presumably dreaming about her beheaded mother. So horrible, horrible, really horrible. And at the other side of the spectrum, she was really very joyous. So she knew how to enjoy herself. She was very flirtatious. She was very vain. So she was a kind of like roller coaster character. So cautious, suspicious, moody, nervous, ambivalent, and very, very inconsistent. So her courtiers or her politicians, what she might have agreed upon one day, she would totally disagree on that on the next day. And we will find proof of that in her chart, of course. Right. So, ta-da, here we have that. And I undertook it to make it a little bit clearer. So this is how I approach a chart, to make it a bit clearer. So, I mean, we only have to look at her face to trace the Capricorn, right? It's very bony, a very bony face. So that's what makes the Capricorn rising. And Saturn, the ruler of the first house, is in the 7th house of relationships and public. And as if not enough, so Saturn comes in tow with Uranus, which of course wasn't discovered by that time, but still we do have the benefit now as modern astrologers to take these modern planets also into account. Also, we have Pluto, a retrograde Pluto in the first house. And I mean, funnily enough, this is what we are soon to experience, right? Pluto entering Aquarius. So she might be a role model for a typical Pluto in Aquarius generation. And of course, relationships aim always at a cost to her. So she always had to be on her guard. Whenever she drank wine, she had it diluted with water. So it was always just like one helping of wine and then with half. So the Renaissance equivalent to a spritzer, you might think. A moon in Taurus. So I think that's her other side. So she was known to enjoy company, also of women. She had a governess. She was very fond of her. She had ladies in waiting. She had friends. And of course, she was able to enjoy herself. And she was a very sensuous woman. She did like sweets, like any rich Renaissance woman. And of course, her teeth fell out. So she had only like 2 or 3 black teeth left when she was in her 40s. But then again, I think that everybody had black teeth at that time. So this is nothing exotic. Right, so the moon is also the ruler of the 7th house. And this combination of a Saturn in Cancer, so like the mother of the nation, and Saturn in the 3rd house, the 3rd house of marketing, if you will. And she commissioned a sort of like, okay, I only want my face to be drawn in this fashion, and any other portrait which she considered as unflattering, she had destroyed. And she always wanted to get painted by Italian painters because they knew the art of having only light from the front, so that the light would be evenly distributed and not showing any unflattering shadows in the face. So we only have these very, very similar looking portraits of her. There is one portrait which has survived, which shows her very, very wrinkly, which must have escaped her very, very watchful eyes. All right, and of course, Venus in Libra. So she was a charmer when called upon. She liked conversation. She was very, she knew the art of conversation, which any noble woman in that period of history knew. So they were all very, very accomplished. But at the same time, I mean, look at what poor Venus in the 8th house also. I mean, Sun in 8 and Venus in 8 is facing. So an opposition of, and now it comes, I mean, it really hurts just to look at that. Excuse me. So Chiron sits at Lilith. Chiron, Lilith in opposition to Venus. Because normally we would say, wow, a Libra Venus, that's fun, but actually no. And then if you follow the square, we can see that both Venus and Lilith Chiron square the ascendant. And that's what must have made her appearance and the way she came across very, very alluring, and at the same time very vulnerable. I think she was a very, very vulnerable woman. And the two, well, I mean, they're not planets, but the 2 placements here are in Aries. And these would, so I mean, like Lilith in Aries would be the warrior queen, but with Chiron in tow, that always comes with, you really have to fight, to struggle, to just live through, because Aries is the first sign. So this is a very, very important placement. And in terms of astrological proof, I would argue that we would find here the very core of why she remained the Virgin Queen. I mean, honestly, look at that, right? Then Pluto in the first house. I mean, look at these eyes. This is not only Capricorn, but this is also very Plutonian because it's suspicious. Someone who just, you know, with piercing eyes, very inquisitive, like nothing would get lost on her. So she would really would have made a good detective if circumstances would have been differently. Also, I mean, look at Mars in very flighty and nervy Gemini. We don't have the expression to be of two minds in German, but I'm a great fan. So whenever I teach about Gemini, I always offer that metaphor, like, okay, so that's saying I am of two minds, because since it's a dual sign, like Pisces, it's a sign of ambivalence. And I think ambivalence is the very core of Elizabeth Tudor. To top it off, the Sun, the very rational, detail-oriented, very prim and proper Sun in Virgo, is in an opposition with Neptune. So we might argue that since her father was so very powerful, and also his court was a very glamorous court, and the Sun also is the father figure, and particularly this episode of the Armada trying to invade England, and the story about her coming to the troops and addressing them and claiming that although she was only a woman, she was also a king, and a king of England too. So she always had to try to be the living proof that merely because she was a woman, that wouldn't necessarily mean that she was weak, right? And that must have been very stressful, because on the other hand, she enjoyed being feminine, showing off her charm. She could play the flute, I think, and the, well, it's not called piano, but what they have in German, it's called a Spinett. Well, you know what I mean anyway. So a very complex character, as the chart displays. Okay, let's skip to Mary. And we have different Marys. We have romantic, young Mary, like captured here in the 1971 movie. So Vanessa Redgrave makes a very beautiful Mary, I think. So she was romantic, and she was given to, I think she liked being in love, and she had very good female friends, and she was in love with many men. And this whole idea, so you could even argue that she was more like a medieval figure, like a damsel in distress, and on the verge of the Renaissance, because on the other hand, she had all the makings of becoming a great Renaissance prince, because she was highly accomplished as well. And then we have the warrior queen, not afraid at all of escaping in the middle of the night from Lochleven Castle, leave everything behind her. She led armies into battle, and she was really known to be fearless, absolutely fearless. Then, of course, we have Martyr Mary, as you know, the martyr of the Catholic faith, and she tried to sell her off, disregarding the fact that she, of course, plotted against Queen Elizabeth. And if one of the plots would have succeeded, she would have happily sat on the English throne. So she wasn't quite as innocent as she wanted history to see her. If you Google it, it's very exciting, because many of Mary's correspondence from her imprisonment years in ciphers have recently been discovered, and researchers are at the point of breaking some of her codes. So that's like really exciting. It's almost like Mary, after hold on, almost 500 years, is talking to us and revealing her secrets, if you will. This is very dramatic. So she was known to be a good actress as well, just as Elizabeth. And when she undressed to get beheaded, she had a flaming red undergarment, because she didn't want the blood to spoil a black or a white dress. And also in the Catholic faith, red is the color of martyrdom. Okay, the beheading, by the way, must have been a pretty gruesome affair, because the axe had to strike 3 times, because I don't know. So the first was more on the head, the second was more too low, and only the third did sever off the head. Horrible, really horrible. But then again, the Renaissance period is not only about fine manners and glamorous costumes and so on. It's also a very cruel time in history where a life didn't mean much. So, okay. So this is the Dauphin, Francis, who died when he was only 15. So those were like children, king and queen. So she was the queen consort. And Maria de Medici was a queen mother. And after her son's death, another son became king, and she wanted to get rid of Mary, and Mary had to go back to Scotland, because her mother, who reigned in her name, died in the same year. When Mary came back as a French-speaking devout Catholic, Scotland had become not only Protestant but Calvinist. You know, John Knox, if you Google him, who was absolutely fierce. And imagine a widowed queen who knew how to dance, how to indulge in music and clever conversation, coming back to a country which was still, you know, like 100 years back in time. So really medieval. Singing and dancing was forbidden, so it must really have been a shock. And what she did, she established a little tiny court. So she brought a little piece of France with her, which her people were a bit ambivalent of, because by the time she came back, it was really considered to be a mortal sin to wear bright colors, to sing, to dance, to indulge, to drink wine. And she was a very sensuous woman. And during a short period of time, so we're talking the early 1560s, Scotland had a young queen, England had a young queen. In France, there was Maria de Medici. So that time in history was really special, because 3 main countries in Europe had female monarchs. which was unheard of before. And both the Scottish and the English queen were unmarried. So there was a sort of like battle going on, like who gets married firstly. And of course, whichever husband one queen took must have an influence at the other queen, because Scotland and England shared, as you know, on one island, and Catholic, Protestant, whom to marry, like a foreign prince, like Elizabeth's elder sister, Bloody Mary had done. She had married Philip of Spain, which was a very, very unpopular choice in England. So really, the Spaniards were really unpopular. And on the other hand, if you marry someone from your own country, it can't be equal. So it can never be an equal footing, because royal blood has to marry royal blood. And after a couple of years, Mary became tired, because Elizabeth always told her, well, if you marry someone whom I am approved, you will be my heiress presumptive, right? So she just dangled her crown under Mary's eyes. And of course, Mary was a very, very ambitious woman, and she was fully aware that she had the lesser crown of the island, the more primitive country, and that, of course, England was more glamorous. So England wasn't France, but still it was more glamorous. So, and after a couple of years, she had enough, and she had hot blood. She was a young, beautiful woman, and she decided to marry Henry Lord Darnley, a cousin of Elizabeth, a Catholic cousin, who also was, I don't know, like on fourth or so. So he would have brought the rights to inherit the English throne as well. So Mary married him, and Elizabeth was really furious. And this alliance very, very quickly cooled off, because Mary soon realized that she had just married a beautiful face, and Henry Lord Darnley was a very weak character. He was given to wild temper tantrums. He frequented brothels. He plotted against Mary, and after a while, she was sick and tired of him. So they had a son, the later King James, and after that, he had done his duty, and Mary didn't know how to dispose of him. And it's still not proven whether in the plot to murder him, she was involved or not. But by being implicitly involved, Elizabeth was furious, and of course the Scottish nobility was furious, and the next man she married was Lord Bothwell, who was certainly involved in the murder. And apparently by the time her first husband was murdered, Mary was pregnant. She was pregnant by Lord Bothwell, and they had to marry. And of course, the Scottish nobility was against this marriage. Elizabeth was against this marriage. And time was not on their side. So what happened? They were captured. She was imprisoned, and she was able to escape. And then she had an army to march against the other party, the Protestant party, but they lost. And then she had to make up her mind, embark on a ship and go to France, where she had been, princess and queen once, or trust her cousin Elizabeth, who once had promised her that whenever she was in trouble, her dear sister could come over to England and she would fight for her cause. So in a spur of a moment, so she was a very impulsive woman, she got over to Carlisle. So she was on English soil, and that was a big mistake because Elizabeth was advised not to let her slip to her fingers again. So not let her go back to Scotland and reinstall her as queen, because what good would have that done to Elizabeth, and not let her escape to France. So to keep her locked up. And that's a very, very tricky affair, because to bring a fellow queen on trial on account of her being guilty of murdering her husband, I mean, what business of Elizabeth was it? But foolishly enough, Mary agreed because she thought they won't find anything against me and they would prove me right, and then I can return to Scotland. No, no, no. And that sealed her fate. Let's skip to her. All right, no, we have to have a look at her chart first and then at her solar return of 1568. But let's skip to her chart first, right? So Taurus rising. Interestingly, with Chiron in the first house. So maybe it's this tragedy, this tragic whiff she had on her, this double bind, a very sensuous, a very physical woman who still had something vulnerable about her, and she always played the feminine card, so to appeal to men's chivalry, if you will. Venus in the 7th house, also like Elizabeth, Saturn in the 7th house. So we have Chiron, Saturn in opposition, and both forming a T-square to Pluto, right? So we have Mars-Pluto conjunction in the 11th house in Aquarius. Then we have the moon in Capricorn in the 10th house. We have a sun in the 8th, end of 8th, maybe bordering to the 9th. I mean, there is good reason, because she had dealings with foreign countries. That would be like more sun in the 9th, but all her entanglements would rather be, and her plotting would rather be like, no, 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 it's a sun in the 8th. Interestingly, we find a grand trine. So sun trine with Uranus and trine to Lilith. And of course, the locked up woman who has to fight for herself in the 12th house is a very powerful pattern, wouldn't you agree? And also in opposition to Jupiter, right? So this is a different recipe. This is a different mold. So very fierce on the one hand, particularly under all that adventurous, passionate, fierce, and interesting and alluring sides to Mary. There is something with the moon in Capricorn to be able to endure hard times. Okay, so this is the synastry, but just one step back. because I wanted to show you the solar return of 1568, the year in which she lost her crown and entered English soil, never to leave it again. So it's an accumulation in the 5th house. And we have the Pluto in the 8th house, and we have this interesting T-square here. So Jupiter in opposition with Neptune, and both in a square with Pluto. Sorry for that. Let me go back. Here we go. So what does this full 5th house tell us? It tells us that normally she would have had a very tempestuous year, and since she is a December birth, so it's the end of 1568, but the bulk of 1569, when she was already imprisoned, is what's to be taken into account. And of course we have Chiron in the 6th house, and we have Moon in the 12th. So now let's have a look at how these two cousins got along astrologically. So first of all, it's no mystery that suns in the same modality. So we have a sun in Virgo versus a sun in Sagittarius. That this is a different, this is a different game altogether. So we can clearly see the Virgo traits in Elizabeth, and we can clearly see the Sagittarius traits in Mary. Then the inner wheel is Elizabeth, by the way, and the outer wheel is Mary. So that doesn't make any sense to say Sun quincunx Mary. No, sorry. It's Mary's Mars. So that should say Sun. So Elizabeth's Sun in the quincunx to Mary's Mars. So this is a bit like nipping at a heel. So Elizabeth felt for the whole time. So she was dangerous when she was running free, and she was even more dangerous when she was in prison, because there were constantly plottings going on against Elizabeth. So Mary was really a ticking time bomb, if you will. So very, very dangerous. So Elizabeth's Jupiter in a conjunction with Mary's Sun. So the very idea of there being a illegitimate usurper sitting on the English throne, which by Catholic right would have been Mary's, had this, you know, this is like Jupiter, like a glittering, dangling piece of jewelry in front of Mary's Sun, if you will, right? So on the other hand, Elizabeth's Neptune forms a square to Mary's Sun, and Elizabeth played games with Mary, and Mary was a wee bit on the naive side, and all this correspondence in which Elizabeth promised her that she was her cousin, her fellow queen, and she would always protect her, and that was all not to be the truth. Elizabeth is known to be very, very ambivalent about Mary, because on the one hand, she was curious. She would have liked to meet her. Then she shied away. Sometimes she wanted to get rid of her, like, okay, let her escape to France, whatever, I don't care, or go back to Scotland because she would kill herself anyway. And on the other hand, she hated her. She deeply hated her because she had had a son. She had experienced carnal love, if you will. And of course, many a courtier wanted to visit Mary and was very curious and came back with tales how charming and accomplished Mary was. And that, of course, you know, wasn't something to make Elizabeth more inclined to help her out. The moons are also interesting, particularly Elizabeth's. So Mary's Saturn in opposition to Elizabeth's moon. So if we put ourselves into Elizabeth's shoes, so the moon, in particular the moon in Taurus, wants to feel at ease, wants to have peace and quiet. And then we have Saturn in Scorpio in an opposition, so like a party pooper, like the mere existence of Mary was a hindrance to Elizabeth to enjoy herself, to feel safe, because that's what the moon in Taurus wants, to feel safe, right? Also, Mary's ascendant and Mary's Chiron, if we allow a wider orb, is sitting at Elizabeth's moon. So again, the danger, but also the double bind of feeling pity, feeling compassionate, and also hatred. So there was no possibility that the healing part of Chiron from Mary's side would have been beneficial to Elizabeth, because circumstances were against it. I mean, it's a really exciting thought to picture them two together, like meeting in the flesh, but that was not to be. And to top it off, if you twist the nodes, so they are 9 years apart, so the north node sits on the south node and vice versa. And that, for me, is clearly a karmic pattern. All right. This is the composite. And interestingly enough, we have a Sun in Scorpio in the 8th house. Hooray! That's very rewarding for someone like me who takes such a keen interest in the 8th house. And again, we have this T-square pattern here with Pluto in the 12th. So behind the scenes, if you will, cloak and dagger, and Uranus in the 6th house, which of course is the ticking time bomb. Wouldn't you agree? The ticking time bomb. And we have something else here, which I find very interesting. Hold on, sorry. So many charts. So we have Black Moon Lilith sitting on Mars. And of course, both women had to fight for their own womanhood, to be a woman of their time, independent of men. Of course, they were victims of male politics, if you will, but still, they tried their best to fight as women. This is the tragic end, and this is the composite in the middle, and we have Pluto in a very, very tight orb. So we're talking Pluto 8.5 degrees sitting on the composite. And of course, we all know that a composite is an artificial chart, but still it equals the relationship, if you will, sitting on Neptune at 8.5 degrees. I mean, 8:31 and 8:31. I mean, really, this is the day of the beheading, and Jupiter, and I find that Jupiter oftentimes plays an important role in anything to do with death, because if you believe in the soul becoming free and living on, this is, if you will, the soul breaking free. Of course, it's a square, right? So this is the death the death, oh, what a word. This is the death warrant, and her politicians tried to do the execution very, very quickly. And rumor has it that after the deed was brought back to Elizabeth, like, okay, your cousin has died, she exploded, and she had a tantrum, and she went into a deep depression, because that was the moody nature of her character, because she argued that she had signed the deed but not giving leave to actually do the beheading. And after that, she blamed everybody else, but she wanted to wash her hands off that cruel deed. Which is a strange story, isn't it? And particularly important is that 1587 was the beheading of Mary, Queen of Scots, and 1 year later, 1588 was the year of Elizabeth's greatest triumph, the defeat of the Armada, and sadly enough, Robert Dudley died in that year. So after that, she was a changed woman. All right. So that's it. Hooray, I managed to go through it in 60 minutes.
That must be a record.
Yeah. And it's so much food for thoughts, wouldn't you agree? This is so rich. This is such a rich material, right?
Most definitely. And I know you spoke, because you mentioned there with some of the charts there, you used the composites, and I know you said, we know it's a fictional, but I just wanted to ask, do you ever use the, you know, there's two types of composites. You've got the Davison, yes. Because the Davison one is actually a real point in time, it's actually a real chart.
Right.
Whereas the one that we tend to use is the midpoints.
Exactly. Exactly.
But there's one that uses its time, so it uses the time between the two charts.
That's true.
And it uses the midpoints, and it's a real chart because it's a real point in time. But
I agree with you, and I would argue that it's fine whatever you juggle with, and and work with whichever chart makes sense to you.
Yeah.
So that's what I always do.
Yeah. Right? I mean, they're often very similar anyway, to be quite honest.
They are.
Noticed, but,
so they only differ in teensy little detail.
Yeah, stuff. Yeah, or sometimes it will be in the opposite sign, like the stuff will go to the opposite sign. But I mean,
so what I like in particular about this pairing is it's an interesting mix of strength and weakness.
Well, yes,
in charge, as opposed to being the victim of the circumstances, because roles were handed to them, and they had very little leeway. Very little leeway in the end, I think, because they were so different in terms of character, in terms of bringing up, in terms of fortune, good fortune, mixed fortune, bad fortune.
Yeah.
So and history made you know what, who was the winner queen and who was the loser queen in the end.
Yeah.
And that's how we still see them, and that's why I'm always an advocate to add more nuances.
Right. Yeah.
You know, and I'm sure they were both very, very fascinating women. And
no, definitely.
I've been thrilled to meet any of these. You know.
Yeah, no, especially
Martin, this is Wanda. You can't see me. My video's not working.
Oh, that's a shame. Hello, Wanda. Anyway.
Hello.
Nice to hear you.
I thought I knew a lot about Tudor history, but you certainly gave a few facts there that I didn't know about. So thank you. What I was interested to see, because I've not seen Mary, Queen of Scots chart before, they both have Saturn in the 7th house, do they not?
Yes, that's true.
And if I remember rightly, Mary has her Saturn square, is it Pluto and Mars
and
the
Mars,
node,
yes.
which rather describes the death of all 3 husbands before her.
That's true.
I mean, 2 probably were killed and 1 died of illness, I believe.
So the Dauphin died from an ear infection. The second was killed, and the third was put in prison in Denmark and rotted away, who lived a grueling 10 years, and he just rotted away in a Danish prison. Absolutely horrible.
Yeah.
So he
and that really shows in her chart, doesn't it, with the sun, with the Saturn, Pluto, and Mars.
She left a trail of blood wherever she went, obviously, really. So
I can't remember what's. I think they were both quite passionate women, because
yes, they were.
Elizabeth had that moon in Taurus and Venus in Libra. She just was an inhibited woman.
Of course, on account of that Chiron Lilith, arguably, right?
Oh yes, I'd say one aspect. And what about that Saturn? What does it do? It squares the Mercury, does it? No.
It does. It does.
Does it?
Yeah, it's both cardinal, mid cardinal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, and it also opposes Pluto, doesn't it? And Uranus. So
yes,
that's pretty heavy too.
And of course, it's this question of ambivalence. I mean, Saturn, Uranus is a ticking time.
That's ambivalent, yes.
So, and of course, she enjoyed the company of men, and she was flirting, but she could never really enjoy anything bordering on intimacy. So I think she was a very, very lonely creature, very lonely creature.
I think she didn't want to give her power away.
Exactly. Yeah. And in her dying months, she didn't even want to be put to bed. So
that's right. She died standing up, didn't she?
Yes.
Wow.
Like a puppet, like a puppet. And so a tragic figure, but also a very glamorous figure. And I think, I mean, for you guys, this is like really, really part of your heritage, and which must make you proud, because so much is rooted in her politics, in the times she lived. So this is, I think, a very essence of the British character, absolutely. Versus, I would argue, if you talk to any proud Scotsman or Scotswoman, they would be on the Stuart side and on the Mary side. You know what I'm saying? And they would.
Well, I heard once that people were a little fed up having the Tudors on the throne. Yes. But after the Stuarts, they wish they had the Tudors,
they were worse.
The Tudors back.
That lot was worse, absolutely. And then the Hanoverians were brought in from Germany.
Because they were Protestant.
They were Protestant. They had to look like, I think the Electress Sophia was the 32nd in line. And all the other were unsuitable because they were Catholics. So they really had to dig very deep.
Well, we owe you a debt for telling us a little bit about our history.
Yeah, but I know that you take a keen interest in German history, Wanda.
I do.
Yeah, so we are in reception, in mutual.
We're mutual reception.
Yeah.
Okay, does this mean I have to now give a talk on German history?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So probably sissy.
Yeah. Why not? I'm doing a lecture for the Austrian conference, and I talk about Jupiter and the dark side of Jupiter, and the Empress Elizabeth Sissi had Jupiter rising in Virgo, and of course she was a hypochondriac, and she had an eating disorder, and she was vain as nothing. And that's a good example of a Jupiter going wild,
And yet she was a forerunner in so many ways as well.
Yes.
I mean, she took her gym with her everywhere.
I know.
That's JYM. No, GYM, GYM.
And she drove everyone crazy. And I mean, next week we will talk about Marilyn Monroe and Sir Laurence Olivier and the horrific making of The Prince and the Showgirl in 1956.
Wow.
So, I mean, honestly, if you ever talk about two people who were just put on earth by the purpose of pissing each other off, those two are ejected.
the epitome.
And there is so little known, and there are some books and a documentary, and that is such a thrilling story. That is so entertaining. I mean, it's tragic as well, but very, very entertaining. And if you compare the charts, you will say, oh, why haven't they consulted an astrologer before meeting? Come on. I mean, how stupid can you be, right?
Wow.
Yeah. Next.
I didn't know it was that bad. I knew they didn't get on at all, but I didn't realize how bad it was.
Yeah, I mean, she was a method actor, and Sir Lawrence, of course, was a classic actor. So it was all about pretending and acting, and Marilyn wanted to feel it, and she had to be in the right mood and memory. And she had her own production company, Marilyn Monroe Production, and her partner, Milton Green, was so stupid not only to book Sir Lawrence as an actor, but as a director. And that was the fatal mistake, because working along him as a wooden actor to make love to was hard enough, but he was the director, so he had too much power over her. And of course, she brought Arthur Miller in tow, and he had his own agenda, and she started sleeping badly and becoming addicted to pills. So this was really where the rest of her life went bad.
Wow.
Well, I look forward to it.
Yeah,
I look forward to hearing.
Sounds better than the film.
Yeah.
Well, the film is very joyous, and she even received an award. I think the Italian Oscar, the Di Donatello Award, and she is such a joy to watch. I don't think there is any movie where she looks more beautiful, because she looks a bit more natural. So she has a sort of like dark blonde wig, and it's an Edwardian period piece, and a figure-hugging, beautiful dress, and she's absolutely charming. And it's hard to imagine that the hardships that she had gone through, that she also produced such a joyous appearance on screen. And he, of course, is wooden as hell. And I mean,
he wasn't a very good film actor.
When he was young, yes, and after that,
I disagree.
He was a great stage actor.
And The Entertainer, that came after
he was
that.
brilliant in that. Yeah,
and that was 1960, and The Prince and the Showgirl was 1956. And after that, he regained his career by playing The Entertainer.
Yeah,
and
no, he was quite wooden. I wonder, I don't want to preempt your talk. I wonder if there's a bit of jealousy there.
Oh, absolutely. 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 But I mean, his marriage to Vivian Leigh, the most tempestuous marriage.
That's right. Yes.
Wow. And she had a borderline
schizophrenia.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So she must have been a very complicated woman. Very entertaining, very funny, very witty, sharp as a knife. but moody as hell and really given to horrible.
You know,
outfit.
sometimes that was like a Taurus Scorpio connection between
Yes.
him and Vivian Lee.
I
But
agree.
everything depends on the moon, doesn't it? Because
It
she had
does.
the moon in Aquarius
It
and he
does.
had it in Virgo.
Yeah.
And I don't think they were sort of, well, comfortable bedfellows in a way.
Well, he was
They
still
couldn't live
married.
together.
She was still married, and they fucked all the time. And they went to
I
Hollywood.
didn't mean literally bedfellows. I mean, they couldn't live with each other easily.
I think that hits the nail with a hammer.
Yeah.
They couldn't live with each other, and they couldn't live without each other.
Without each other.
Mm.
So, as so many of these
Yeah.
celebrity marriages, right?
Yeah. Mm.
So it's
Yeah, they did really love each other, no doubt about that. But it's
Good.
when the door was shut, they couldn't be comfortable with each other. I think Moon Virgo, Moon Aquarius. I mean,
That's
the
true.
moon is where you feel comfortable, isn't it?
I agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, well,
Yeah, good to have this discussion with you.
yeah, definitely. I'm looking forward to next week.
To be continued, yeah.
Yeah, to be